In April 2021, Luo Hanzong posted on the China-based media platform Lying Flat is Justice. This grew into what is now known as the Lying Flat movement, with its more recent evolution reported this month as Letting It Rot. It is part of a growing protest against a culture of productivity that has been entrenched in Chinese society for many decades now. Such a culture of productivity is not limited to China, but can be found in many Asian societies such as India and Japan, not to mention my country of origin, Singapore, where the term toxic productivity is gaining attention. For this presentation, I follow Melis Hafez's understanding of culture of productivity as a, and I quote, socially constructed series of anxieties, practices, and discourses on work and laziness, end quote. In this regard, Singapore's current Prime Minister famously said in a televised forum in 2013 that people from Vietnam, China, and India are hungry, anxious, about to steal your lunch, so I better guard my lunch. It drove home for many Singaporeans that the onus of guarding our lunches depends on our individual efforts to stay productive. Yet, according to the Ministry of Manpower in Singapore in March 2022, Singaporeans work an average of 44.2 hours a week. We rank in the top 25 countries with the longest work weeks, ahead of countries like Hong Kong, Korea, and Japan, but behind China and Malaysia. It is unlikely that these statistics capture properly jobs that do not follow strict office hours, such as domestic helpers and gig economy workers. Nonetheless, it is a good indicator that work, or guarding our lunch, is a consuming part of the lives of many people in Singapore. Let us now turn to some discourses within the Singaporean church. Let me quickly caveat that what follows does not claim to represent the church, but rather to highlight significant discursive flows within the church. This is not a witch hunt. In this regard, a common phrase within local church circles is the Protestant work ethic. Debates on the Protestant work ethic are well documented, and I do not wish to rehearse them here, as it becomes another Eurocentric discussion. Suffice to say, while it seems to me that it has been largely negatively received by the church in the West, the reception in Singapore, at least, has generally been positive. So, how is the church engaged with the culture of work in Singapore? In the interest of time, I will only raise the following brief points for consideration. First, on the one hand, there is a valorization of honesty and diligence. On the other hand, all kinds of laziness are demonized, and often implicitly associated with complaining and deception. A Bible passage often used is Ephesians 4:28. Second, one needs to do the work with joy, no matter the consequences, and without complaint, which often draws inspiration from Paul in Colossians 3 and Philippians 2. Third, frugality is often emphasized as preachers warn against increasing the standard of our living. Instead, we need to increase the standard of our giving. Fourth, the ultimate goal is for the sake of witness. Here, a prominent preacher used the example of Christians during Gorbachev's era. He cites Gorbachev saying, "Why do we oppress the very people who do not absent themselves from work, who are not alcoholics, and who give us a productive day's work? We need their strength." Being a model worker is often argued as what constitutes an effective witness, with the ultimate goal of inspiring non-Christians to ask questions about God and possibly come to church. This is often seen as an indicator of productivity or fruitfulness. So what are some implications we need to consider? First, by moralizing productivity, ecclesial cultures reinforce the prevailing secular binary understanding of productivity and laziness, without questioning the underlying logics of capitalism that determine these terms. Rather, the concern is to be the model employee who constantly exudes joy, never complains or lies, is diligent to a fault, and not to mention extremely discerning with his or her money. The underside of this work ethic is that it often breeds a sense of submission to authority and obedience to rules that's often uncritical and unquestioning. Second, apart from the mental health fallout, Christians are so consumed by this culture that they cannot find the space and time to do the important work of imagining a different social order. Third, many churches instrumentalize productivity to their own ends. How much have you given to church? How many have you brought to church? What are you doing in church? Ultimately, these various discursive forces reinforce and entrench current extractive and potentially exploitative modes of capitalist practices. Here I seek a modest intervention through the topos of the tree as a point of convergence between two masters, Jesus and Zhuangzi. I approach the tree as a unit of production, not unlike how humans are treated in the current capitalist arrangements. In the interest of time, I look at how the tree as a unit of production is portrayed and troubled in their respective storytelling. In particular, Jesus telling the parable of the fruitless fig tree in Luke 13, and Zhuangzi narrating the story of the carpenter encountering an oak tree in the fourth of the inner chapters entitled 人间世第四. In the spirit of hospitality, I begin with the Zhuangzi. The story is about carpenter Shi, who chooses to overlook a large oak tree as a potential source of wood on the way to the state of Qi. When asked by his apprentice, he explains that the wood of the tree must be useless since it has lived for so long. After carpenter Shi returns presumably home, the tree visits him in a dream, saying, "You and I are both things. How can you as one thing judge me, another thing, in such a manner? How are you, a useless man, able to know so much about me, a useless tree?" Allow me to make two quick points. First, the tree is able to live so long precisely because it is useless to humans. And we later find out that as a result of not being cut down, it is able to provide shade and shelter to all who come to the temple that is located near it. Furthermore, the tree makes the point that plucking fruit, as opposed to picking it from the ground when it is ready, will also harm the branches. In other words, its fruitlessness is a kind of, and I quote, a cultivation of uselessness necessary for safety from exploitation. Quote. Second, Zhuangzi is not interested in indulging laziness. Rather, he wants to challenge the understanding of usefulness and uselessness by turning what is useless useful and what is useful useless. In other words, his concern is to interrogate the underlying logics of productivity. With this all too brief outline, let us now turn to another tree. In Luke chapter 13, verses 6 to 9, Jesus tells the story of an owner coming to inspect his vineyard. He finds a fig tree that is barren, calls the man who works in the vineyard to cut down the tree. The man then pleads for one more year's grace as he makes a last-ditch effort to fertilize it. Should the tree fail to bear fruit by then, it will be cut down. What's mainly disputed is what constitutes fruitfulness. Traditional historical critics see it as a call to repentance, be it for a limited context of Israel or Christians in general. This does not seem to differ much from modern receptions of this parable by pastors in Singapore, where repentance before Jesus Christ is often emphasized. It is not unusual that it is broadened to the fruits of the Spirit, as Paul talks about it in Galatians 5, and commitment to church in terms of attendance and bringing people to church. So while critics and preachers alike debate about what fruitfulness looks like, hardly anyone disputes that the role of the fig tree is to bear fruit for human beings. The closest I found is Charles Hedrick's work on fig trees in the ancient world, where he points out that it is, and I quote, common practice to plant fig trees in vineyards to aid in the trellising of vines, end quote. So it seems to Hedrick that this is an odd parable, because a fig tree is not expected to produce fruits within the vineyard. Sadly, the rest of his reading does not follow up any further on the problematic he has raised. Let us now put the two stories in conversation with one another. In the interest of time, I focus on how the parable in Luke 13 could be read in the light of Zhuangzi's story of the useless tree. I begin with a relatively harsher treatment of Jesus' parable before considering perhaps a more conciliatory reading. Let us assume that Jesus' view of the fig tree follows Western and Singaporean interpreters, who understand its purpose as producing fruit for man's consumption. In this light, if I were to read it through Zhuangzi's attempts to trouble the very values that the wealthy has put on things and people, it does not appear that Jesus is that concerned about the connections between profit and use. Instead, the fig tree faces an all too familiar threat that some of us might be well acquainted with: produce or perish. There might be a case to argue that Jesus is being a benevolent dictator, enforcing the logics of productivity but with compassion and love. But is such a Jesus enough? A more generous reading of Jesus' parable, I argue, might require a little mental gymnastics. Zhuangzi's story overturns human understanding of what is useful and what is useless. Here I wish to draw out Hedrick's point that fig trees in vineyards were meant to function as trellising for the vines. So what if Jesus was subverting this use of the fig tree? Instead of supporting the vineyard that mainly serves the elite in the empire, it is supposed to be producing fruit of its own, or at the very least change its own mode of production. In this light, could Jesus' way of confounding the role of the fig tree as trellising give us pause to consider how the logics of productivity can be subverted in creative ways? In closing, this presentation has been particularly difficult for me as someone brought up deeply embedded within and indebted to discourses of toxic productivity. I could speak more to this later if anyone's interested. So while a generous reading could be what is preferred by many in the church, including myself, I find that gravitating towards resisting this parable is a better way to resist my own internal urges. In doing so, I cannot help but hear the fig tree crying out to the owner, "How are you, a useless man, able to know so much about me, a useless tree?" Yet, unlike the old oak tree, should the fig tree choose to maintain its uselessness, it not only does not see its own potential fulfilled in old age, but also does not have the last word.
I find it very interesting, but Stephen's subject is something which is very new for me. And he's bringing out about uselessness and usefulness and connected with the people's life. And see, from my place, from Mizoram, though I'm Indian, I'm in mainland India now, when I talk about my place, my context, I always refer to Mizoram. Now, because from Mizoram, we look up to Singapore and then Singaporean, and we look up them as a very, very hardworking people. That is how we know them. And also, like in our family, also we encourage the younger ones to work hard to be able to match the work culture of the Singaporean and the Japanese, because we know them as a very hardworking people. And now today, when I see that the toxic productivity, that strikes me. So the first question that comes into my mind is the productivity and the work culture which they have. Is it harmful for human? And when it comes to the tree, Zhuangzi tree, and about the uselessness as the resistance, and that is that uselessness itself is a key for the tree for longevity. And so now, and then I assume that the people are working so hard and they are having that culture of toxic productivity. Because of that, the lifespan is short or what? And so I feel that I'm not getting exactly what is the meaning of toxic productivity and how it affects to the people and how it affects to the church. And I also listen that the church, that the direction of the church is like encouraging people to give more, what kind of products they could produce for the church. I think that I understand in that way that the mission of the church is to bring productivity to every members. And so if that is the case, then what is the mission of the church in Singapore? This is one of my questions. And also I hear that even Indian are infected by the toxic productivity, and according to my understanding, those who are working at the ground level of the capitalist society, they are really working hard. They don't have enough salary, and because of that, they live in hunger. That is how my conscience tell me when you talk about lunch. People want to see their lunch. People want to see your lunch. So all these kind of things, and so I have so many mix information, so many informations put into my mind today. And I really cannot pull them together and fix it into one thing. So yeah, maybe because of this thing is very new for me, but at the same time, I'm so much interested. So I'll be very happy if you can make it more clear how this toxic productivity or the culture of productivity have impact to the lives of the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanlalhruaii, for your response. Because of the time, we are taking questions or comments from the audience. which the eDARE team has gathered from Zoom and Facebook. But feel free to ask any questions, and yeah, let's go ahead. And in the meantime, you, Naomi, Stefan, and Vannar, to raise any questions or observations that you wish to share with each other.
Yeah, for me, I want to listen more from Stefan.
Okay. Well, Bella, I just want to say that toxic productivity is a relatively new idea. It's new as an idea, but it's not new as a phenomenon. I think it's been with us for a very, 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 very long time. It's just that I think in recent years, it has become more salient, and it's largely the salience is most probably due to to share, of which the lying flat movement is quite a typical example in some sense of how this phenomenon, previously buried in the deep subterranean levels of capitalist production, has now seen a bit of light. I think most of the literature focuses a lot on the psychological fallout of toxic productivity, which I think China presents a fairly extreme example of it, where they have this idea of the 996, right? You work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. every day for 6 days a week. And that's your entire life. You just wake up, you work until at night, you go home, and then the cycle repeats itself on end until you literally retire. So you can do that for maybe 40 to 50 years. And I think the mental health effects of the toxicity in terms of the mental health effects, I think is quite obvious, right? If you just spend your whole life just working and working nonstop, you would most really end up in what in Japan is now called karoshi, which is literally death by overwork. People die because they work so long in their companies.
Oh, okay.
But I think for me, my concern of toxic productivity is its toxicity to culture itself, right? Because you're so consumed by this constant grind, you can never imagine that it could be different. So one thing, what it does is that it poisons and paralyzes the imagination, because you just don't have time to sit down to imagine, because all you're doing is you're cycling your work over and over and over again. Okay? And I think, in a sense, this logic of productivity is not just limited to how it's practiced in capitalist society, but I think it translates itself in the way that I think it's a phenomenon maybe more in Singapore. I'm not really sure in other parts of the world. But there's a tendency for the Pentecostal churches, the more so-called successful churches, because they're bigger, to submit their church growth into a kind of metrics, right? So they track statistics, they see how many people come to church, they track CG attendance. I mean, in my previous church, it evolved to a point where we use our identity cards to scan in when we go for prayer meetings as a way to check our attendance. And there are other discourses of productivity about, have you discipled 12 people? Where are you on your journey of discipling 12 people? So it adds on to their agenda. So in a sense, it just completely paralyzes the person's ability to imagine a different world. And actually, Ashwin Singh, in his one of the few commentaries that really looks at the cultural productivity, and he thinks about how COVID was an excellent opportunity, right, for all of us to reimagine how we would want a social order. But all our countries want is just to go back to normal. That's all they want. And that's what everybody is moving towards. Nobody is thinking that, oh, now we finally have the ability to press the pause button, and let's now try to reimagine how social relations can be done again. But nobody does that. Everybody's just waiting for the normal to come back. And they have literally squandered this opportunity. And I think a lot of people, not just people who are powerful, literally everything down the ladder, right, has squandered this opportunity to think about it differently.